This is Historic Blah, where the past comes alive in minutes. Before we dive in, hit like, subscribe, and comment your city. I want to see where our history lovers are watching from. Story 1. The Pain of Patterns, the Lost Tattooing Rituals of the Visyas. In the heart of the Visyas, far before the arrival of Catholic crosses and conquistadors, the skin of men and women bore the stories of their lives etched not on parchment but flesh. These were the Badak tattoos once widespread, now nearly vanished, leaving behind faint whispers in oral traditions and forgotten texts in dusty colonial records. You find yourself walking along the old coastlines of Panay or Cebu, not today's bustling cities, but humid shorelines lined with nipa huts and canoes. You hear the waves, the wind slicing through the coconut trees, and the rhythmic tapping tack-tack-tack of thorn against skin. These were not just decorations. They were markings of identity, honor, grief, and survival. The tattooed ones. When Spanish chroniclers first stepped ashore in the early 16th century, they were shocked to encounter the pintados, a term they used to refer to heavily tattooed Visayan warriors and nobles. These chroniclers, particularly Miguel de Lorca and Antonio Pigafetta, noted with fascination, and sometimes revulsion, how every inch of a man's body save his face could be covered in intricate geometric and symbolic patterns. What did these tattoos mean? Each mark signified a lifetime of battles, not just physical but social. The tattoos were earned gradually, awarded as a form of currency paid in blood and pain. A man could not wear the spiral on his chest or the band on his thigh unless he had performed a notable act of valor, especially in battle or through successful sea raids. Pangyo. The pain was part of the ritual, a necessary toll for remembrance. Even more fascinating were the rituals themselves, so embedded in belief, so rooted in the natural world around them. The tools of the trade. Tattooing was no casual affair. The process involved a range of tools, each with a name, each with a purpose. The basic elements. Thorn needles, often taken from calamansi, agujo casuarina, or other sharp plants. A wooden mallet used to tap the needle into the skin. The ink made from soot, mixed with plant resins or ash from specific trees. Everything was prepared in ritual. The soot might come from a sacred hearth, its ashes collected only during the waning moon. The resins, like those from the salong tree, were believed to bring permanence. And the practitioner, the Mambabadak, was no mere artisan, but a person of high status, often trained from childhood, sometimes guided by omens or dreams. As the tattoos were applied, chants were sung, invoking ancestors and anidos, spirit guides, who were believed to witness the event and bless the bearer. This was a deeply spiritual process, blending the body, the cosmos, and the community. Women and the needle. While male warriors earned tattoos through raiding, women had a different path. Women in the Visyas received tattoos for reasons often tied to fertility, coming of age, or clan identification. They were considered symbols of beauty and status, not merely cosmetic but culturally declarative. Some patterns were known to be exclusive to certain families or islands, like a visual surname inked into the skin. However, unlike the warriors, women's tattoos were more abstract, favoring flowing lines, shell patterns, or botanical designs. They were often placed on the arms, hands, or backs where they could be seen, admired, interpreted. But pain was a shared experience. Tattooing required weeks of preparation, fasting, and ritual cleanliness. Coconut oil would be applied to the skin post-tattooing to soothe the swelling and help with healing. Those who endured the full sessions were admired for their fortitude and grace, a quiet kind of heroism often lost in the louder annals of war. Colonial erasure. The arrival of the Spanish marked the slow beginning of the end for tattooing in the Visyas. The practice, associated with paganism and tribal warfare, was considered savage and sinful by friars and officials. A generation after the first contact, tattoos were already fading. People hid them. Children were dissuaded from getting them. The Mambabatok found themselves persecuted or reduced to folk healers and midwives. In time, the ink that once narrated entire lives became forgotten scars. Tattooing persisted longer in the Cordilleras, shielded by mountains and distance. But in the coastal Viscayan regions, it vanished beneath collars and rosaries, relegated to memory and eventually obscurity. Yet the old records remain. Spanish manuscripts, forgotten museum notes, and even carvings in neglected caves still whisper about this once vibrant body language. Patterns as maps. Some scholars now believe that certain tattoos weren't just decorative or commemorative, but cartographic. That is, maps. Could those lines on the shoulder, those curls near the collarbone, represent routes, islands, alliances? Might warriors have borne entire naval histories on their skin? It is difficult to say, for the knowledge holders are long gone. One particularly puzzling design, repeated in various records, involves a series of dots surrounded by spirals seen on bodies recovered from burial jars near Iloilo. The patterns match no known language. Were they navigational, religious, familial? We are left with inked enigmas, unexplained even by contemporary descendants. And so we must ask, what if skin could speak again? What would the bodies of the pintados tell us? If you had lived during the height of Viscayan tattoo culture, perhaps in the 14th or 15th century, you might have heard the rhythmic tapping from a distance. It echoed through palm-covered coastlines, past bamboo dwellings, and across the wind-blown estuaries. This tapping was the sound of a body being marked, not merely for art, but for honor, memory, and place. You would find the Mambabatok at the center of it all, a specialist, healer, and artist combined. A person entrusted with needles and ritual, soot and silence. The keeper of needles. The Mambabatok was not chosen lightly. In many communities, this role was passed down through family lines, but others were selected by omens, such as being born under particular constellations or surviving a serious childhood illness. These were seen as signs of spiritual potency, a trait necessary to endure the dangers of skin marking, which was more than just physical work. Training began early. Apprentices observed silently, collecting soot, sharpening bone needles, and memorizing pattern lexicons etched on banana leaves or carved into bamboo rods. These motifs, passed on for generations, represented a catalog of lives lived and deeds done. But the true test came not with knowledge, but with pain. Before they could tattoo others, apprentices had to tattoo themselves, their left thigh, their upper back, their own hands. If the pain broke them, they could never become full practitioners. It was a test of endurance, not cruelty. A Mambabatok must know how deep is too deep, how to read the winces of others, how to ease discomfort with herb poultices and careful breath. This act was both sacred and social. Tattooing wasn't just an individual act, it was communal theater. Elders watched, children whispered, and the ancestors, it was believed, listened. The ceremony of skin. Tattooing often took place during specific seasons, usually after harvest, during maritime calm, or after a successful raid. These were periods of communal wealth and celebration, when spirits were thought to be more receptive. Before the first tap, the client would undergo a form of cleansing, bathing in fresh spring water, sometimes fasting, and avoiding certain foods like ginger or coconut milk, which were believed to thin the blood or offend ancestral spirits. The chosen design would be drawn first with charcoal, sometimes directly by the client, other times by the Mambabatok. This was followed by invocations whispered to anidos or to deceased warriors, asking that the mark be accepted and its meaning fulfilled. The needle was a thorn or a fishbone lashed onto a stick. The tapping stick a length of wood, often softened by age, delivered consistent, rhythmic pressure. Tag, tag, tag. The sound could go on for hours, sometimes days. Pain was inevitable, But it was not just endured, it was savored. The pain confirmed the worth of the mark. It was common for participants to chant through the process, or for family members to sing stories of lineage and conquest, reminding the client why they chose the design. Post-tattoo, the skin would swell and ooze. A mixture of crushed leaves, sometimes guava or banaba, was applied to cool the inflammation. Coconut oil sealed it. The bearer was often told not to bathe for several days, to allow the ink to settle and listen to the skin. Tattoos as social currency. In Viscan society, tattoos were a visible resume. They dictated who you could marry, which boats you could command, or how much respect your word carried in council. Men with chest tattoos, especially the bangut or facial patterns, were rare and feared. Only those who had slain in battle or captured significant enemy wealth could bear them. A tattoo on the back, in contrast, could suggest you had fled in battle, or worse, been marked forcibly. Tattoos also influenced trade. Foreign merchants, particularly Chinese and Malay traders, were known to comment favorably on heavily tattooed clients, seeing them as seasoned and thus more reliable partners. In essence, the more you were tattooed, the more society trusted your strength, honesty, and experience. But what happened when one bore marks they did not earn? False marks and unspoken shame. Though rare, there are recorded cases often spoken of in hushed tones of individuals attempting to pass off unearned tattoos. These were often young men, seeking prestige to secure a bride or a position of influence. They would travel to remote villages where their history wasn't known and pay Mambabatok to copy battle tattoos. This act was considered not just deceitful, but spiritually dangerous. A body that bore lies was believed to invite misfortune, illness, madness, or loss in battle. Some say entire canoes capsized because a warrior aboard bore a stolen pattern. Others speak of raids that ended in complete defeat after a false chest tattoo was revealed. There are stories of men caught, dragged before elders, and scraped their tattoos cut away with obsidian flakes as punishment. These stories served as cautionary tales, passed from grandfather to grandson, reminding all that marks must be earned, not bought. Ink and afterlife. Tattoos were believed to accompany the dead into the afterlife. The Viscan concept of sulad, a kind of spiritual world, included boats that ferried the dead to the land beyond the sea. It was said that only the tattooed dead could be recognized by their ancestors. Unguarded spirits wandered, lost. Thus, the final tattoo a person received was often referred to as the lacking, a guiding pattern, sometimes applied posthumously by loved ones. It was usually placed on the soles of the feet or the palms to help the spirit find its way. Mambabatok would sometimes be called upon after death to perform this last rite. It was not uncommon for funeral rites to include the scent of burning soot and the light tapping of needles against a wooden bowl, symbolic gestures to awaken the soul's journey. And yet, the Spaniards recorded none of this in detail. Why? They saw tattoos as vanity, sin, pride. The elaborate spiritual framework that underpinned these practices was ignored or worse, erased. In their accounts, the Mambabatok was not a healer or priest but a corrupter, a barrier to salvation. One wonders how much was lost in translation. How much of the language around these tattoos, names, prayers, meanings vanished because it was never written down, only spoken, and only in the act of marking skin. Ghosted by history. Today, few descendants carry these tattoos. The art nearly died entirely, and though revitalization efforts exist especially among Kalinga communities, the Viscan systems remain largely mysterious. Modern Filipinos often look to Cordilleran Mambabatok like a Po Wangad for connection, but the Viscan tattooing system was distinct in design, ritual, and philosophy. So we're left with fragments, sketches in colonial archives, patterns from burial sites, and a few oral tales whispered by elders who were never tattooed themselves, but remember stories told by their own. This brings us to the lingering question: could we ever truly recover the full language of skin if those who spoke it are now silent? The stories we know about the tattooed peoples of the Visyas are incomplete, told mostly by outsiders, shaped by agendas, and filtered through the language of empire. But remnants remain, traces of a culture where skin was memory, and every line had a lineage. As we reach the final part of this story, we look not only at the decline of the tradition, but also at what might be reclaimed and how a dying art still breathes quietly through modern skin. The fade begins. The decline began as colonial presence deepened. Early encounters were marked by curiosity, but within decades, Spanish friars began aggressive campaigns against tattooing. Church sermons associated tattoos with paganism, idolatry, and sin. Converts were encouraged, sometimes forced, to cover their markings. Baptismal rites occasionally required the renunciation of skin art, with parents swearing their children would not be marked like savages. Mambabatok were among the first to be silenced. They were cast as sorcerers or heretics. Without clients, many abandoned the craft or migrated inland, hopping to preserve what they could. Others were converted, retrained as catechists, their old tools destroyed or hidden beneath church floors. By the early 1700s, the pintados had become less a reality and more a memory, reduced to a name on Spanish maps and a few preserved illustrations in Jesuit journals. The cultural amnesia. As generations passed, families grew ashamed of their tattooed elders. Children were raised with stories of good Christians who no longer wore patterns, and histories of tattooing were told as warnings, not legacies. Even language shifted. Words like batok, mangas, and lagbas began to disappear from daily speech. By the late 19th century, tattooing in most lowland Viscayan areas had all but vanished. What had once been central to identity became a curiosity, something mountain people did, or what pirates wore in old tales. Only fragments were preserved, mostly in unexpected places. On the walls of Spanish archives, where artists copied tattoo patterns from prisoners and rebels. In burial jars, where skeletons bore ink-stained bones, evidence that soot had etched deep into the dermis. In Awit and Comdia performances, where stylized costumes occasionally mimicked ancient markings, without knowledge of their origin. By the time American colonization arrived in the 20th century, the pintados were history stripped of meaning, their language of skin lost in the sands of evangelization and war. Echoes in the North. Ironically, the survival of indigenous tattooing in the Cordilleras preserved some Philippine ink heritage, just not the Visayan kind. The Kalinga people, especially in areas like Buscalan, retained their own form of tattooing. Unlike the Visayans, their motifs emphasized rice gods, snakes, centipedes, and fertility. Patterns signified beauty, strength, and divine favor rather than conquest. Apo Wangad, the now famous Mambabatok, became a global icon, inspiring a resurgence of interest in Philippine tribal tattoos. But even she admits, each land had its own language of marks. This raises a question: can the Visayan tattooing system be revived, or is it forever lost? The revival efforts. In recent decades, a small but dedicated group of artists, anthropologists, and community leaders have tried to uncover the old ways. Projects like the Pintados Project and research by Filipino historians like Dr. Annalyn Salvador Amores have begun to piece together the visual grammar of the ancient Visayan ink. They cross-reference Spanish chronicles, archaeological digs, and oral histories still remembered in far-flung barangays. Contemporary tattoo artists, especially in Cebu and Panay, have started adapting these designs into modern work. Their goal is not replication, but revitalization, to bring the spirit, not just the form of the practice back. This is delicate work. Revivalists must balance respect for ancestral beliefs with modern reinterpretation. They must contend with generations of religious conditioning and the danger of romanticizing the past. And yet, people are getting tattooed again with spirals, bands, and sigils drawn not from trend, but from rediscovered identity. A new Mambabatok generation is emerging urban, educated, and spiritually curious. Inheritance on the skin. One woman, Anna, born in Iloilo and raised in Manila, spent years researching her ancestry. She traced her lineage to a barangay once known for warrior raiders and discovered, through dusty church records and oral accounts, that her great-great-grandmother had been one of the last women tattooed in her area. Anna chose to tattoo her left arm with a band design inspired by a burial pattern found in a cave in Panay. The ink was applied not as a statement of fashion, but as a reclamation, a whispered answer to generations who had been told to cover up and forget. "It's not revival," she said, "it's inheritance." Stories like Anna's are becoming more common. Artists gather for cultural ink festivals. Old motifs are reinterpreted in murals and illustrations, and children are told not warned about the tattoos their ancestors once wore proudly. Still, many patterns remain untranslated, many meanings unknown. The silence between marks. What lingers most is not the ink itself, but the silence. In many coastal Visayan communities today, you can walk the same beaches once filled with tattooed warriors. You might even find a carved bamboo tube in an heirloom chest decorated with geometric spirals no one can interpret. And yet the silence holds a kind of space. It invites questions. It holds room for rediscovery. It reminds us that even what is lost can leave an outline, and sometimes the outline is enough to guide us back. Tattooing in ancient Visayas was never just about art. It was testimony to bravery, beauty, bloodlines, and belonging. Its quiet disappearance teaches us about the cost of forgetting. But its slow return teaches us something else. Even lost languages can be remembered not in books, but on the living body. Story 2. Sailing by the Stars: Pre-Colonial Navigation Across the Sulu Sea. Imagine the Sulu Sea not as a barrier, but as a highway. Long before maps were drawn by European hands, and centuries before steamships crisscrossed the archipelago, the peoples of the Philippine Islands were already moving with purpose, precision, and poetry. They crossed open water using nothing more than wind, wood, and memory. In this story, you drift across calm waters under a starlit sky, aboard a Balangay, the iconic plank boat of early seafarers. Around you, the crew adjusts the sail, reads the waves, and whispers to the wind. There are no compasses, no charts, only a mental map carved over generations, and a deep, quiet relationship with the sea. This is the forgotten art of pre-colonial navigation in the Philippines. The sea as homeland. To understand this history, we must unlearn a modern perspective, that land defines identity and water separates. For the Austronesian-speaking peoples, including early Filipinos, it was the opposite. Water was the connector, the medium through which life, trade, and knowledge flowed. The islands were not isolated worlds, but points along a fluid network stretching from Madagascar to Easter Island. The Philippines sat near the center of this oceanic latticework. Communities like the Bajau, Tausug, and Visayan traders saw the sea as familiar, not foreign. It held currents of ancestry, economy, and myth. Every wave had a story. Every island a name whispered through generations. Thus, a boat was never just transport, it was inheritance, a home, and often a living map. The Balangay, boat of memory. Perhaps the most enduring symbol of this maritime legacy is the Balangay. First described in Chinese records as early as the 10th century and later chronicled by Spanish observers, the Balangay was a large planked outrigger canoe, often reaching lengths of 15 meters or more. Constructed using lash lug techniques, its hull was built plank by plank, stitched together with natural fiber and wooden pegs rather than nails. The builders, often from the Butuan region, passed their craft down orally. No blueprints, no written guides. The entire structure was remembered, proportions, measurements, and sacred rituals. A mistake in construction could mean disaster at sea. The very name, Barangay, now used to denote Filipino villages, derives from Balangay, a reflection of how central these boats were to organizing life. The Balangay was not just a vessel of transport, it was a vessel of culture. Navigation without tools. How did they find their way? Long before the arrival of sextants or compasses, pre-colonial Filipino sailors employed a holistic, embodied system of navigation. It relied not on instruments, but on celestial cues. Stars were the primary guides. Sailors memorized star paths, the rising and setting positions of specific stars across seasons. These were recited in song form so they could be taught and remembered. Wave patterns. By feeling the motion of the boat, navigators could detect intersecting swells, which hinted at nearby land or shifts in wind direction. Cloud formations. Certain cloud types, especially the ones hovering low and stationary, were used to spot islands beyond the horizon. Seabird flight. Birds like frigates or terns signaled proximity to shore, especially in early morning or late afternoon. Color of the sea. Subtle variations in water hue suggested reefs, sandbars, or shoals. Smells and sounds. Yes, even scent and sound were tools. Coastal vegetation emitted specific aromas, and crashing waves against unseen shores gave clues during night sailing. All of this was internalized. Knowledge was stored in memory, muscle, and community song. There were no written maps. The navigator was the map. The role of the Palu. In a typical voyage, one person held ultimate authority over direction, the Palu or master navigator. The Palu was often an elder trained from youth, and their value was not only practical but spiritual. Some believed they could speak with the sea or interpret omens. Before a journey began, the Palu might observe stars at dusk, trace patterns in sand, or consult elders about past voyages. Rituals such as sacrificing a chicken or laying leaves on the bow were common to secure safe passage. During the trip, the Palu gave nonverbal cues, taps, glances, gestures. These subtle commands guided the crew. A misstep could mean hitting coral or missing a landfall by days. Some Palu were known by name across islands. Oral cartographers, consulted like walking atlases. But their knowledge was fragile. A death without an apprentice meant the loss of a whole map. Trade winds and the rhythm of raids. Voyages were not random. They followed seasonal wind cycles, especially the Amihan northeast monsoon and Habagat southwest monsoon. During Amihan, winds blew from China and Japan toward the Philippines. This was prime time for inbound trade: porcelain, silk, and iron. During Habagat, local boats could sail back toward Borneo, the Malay Peninsula, or Sulawesi, exporting beeswax, tortoiseshell, and sea cucumbers. But not all voyages were peaceful. These same maritime skills were used in raids targeting rival settlements for slaves, gold, or prestige. Sea raiding, or pangyaw, was both feared and respected. A successful raid elevated one's social status, and returning warriors were often marked with tattoos, as discussed in Story 1. Yet even in raids, navigational skill was essential. Raiders had to leave under cloud cover, return unseen, and land silently. The best navigators were prized not only for distance but for stealth. A disappearing world. By the 1600s, the arrival of European ships and colonial governments began to unravel this maritime network. Spanish galleons brought different technologies and different priorities. Sea travel became militarized. Indigenous vessels were restricted, sometimes outlawed. Raiding was criminalized. Coastal communities were resettled inland, often forcibly, as part of reduction programs. Christian missionaries discouraged reverence for stars and spirits. Navigation songs faded. The Palu grew old with no one to teach. Without ceremony or conflict, the art of navigation slipped beneath the tide. There were no archives, no ship logs. And so we must wonder, what maps have we lost, when the only ones that existed were sung to the sky and whispered to the sea? To sail was to remember. In the era before written words and printed charts, knowledge of the sea had to live inside people, not in ink on paper, but in oral tradition, muscle memory, and ritual repetition. If we are to understand the navigators of pre-colonial Philippines, especially across the complex and shifting waters of the Sulu Sea, we must learn to see memory as map and culture as compass. And we must ask, how did they remember distances across a horizonless expanse? The answer lies in the art of wayfinding. Wayfinding more than direction. The term wayfinding may sound modern, but it describes an ancient and complex process, non-instrumental navigation based on environmental cues and internalized systems of knowledge. Across Austronesian cultures, including the Philippines, wayfinding was practiced with astonishing accuracy. Sulu, Tawi-Tawi, Basilan, Palawan, these were not remote islands to the seafarers of the past. They were familiar markers, regularly visited as part of trade, diplomacy, and migration. The islands were nodes in a maritime network, not endpoints. Each voyage was a chain of memorized segments. From Bohol, sail 3 nights past the big stars setting until the water grows warm. From Jolo, follow the 2 rising stars until the birds change their song. These phrases might sound poetic, but they were technical directions, encoded in a layered, symbolic language passed down through story, chant, and ritual. Some routes had names, and each portion was associated with myths or ancestors, turning practical journeys into spiritual reenactments. To travel was to rehearse history. The role of rhythm. An often overlooked feature of ancient navigation was rhythm. Rowing chants, paddle cadence, and even drum beats were used not only for motivation but as measures of time and distance. A particular chant might be known to last the time it takes to reach a midpoint between 2 islands. A full song might correspond to a moon cycle or a sailing stretch across an open strait. This system worked because voyages were repetitive. Routes were revisited across generations, and songs were updated to reflect changing reefs, shifting tides, or the loss of a landmark tree. In this way, rhythm became a temporal map, a living calendar and odometer in one. And like any map, it was only useful while remembered. Reading the sea's texture. Skilled navigators also learned to read the surface of the water. Even without visible land, sailors could identify proximity to islands by detecting reflected swells, which bounce off unseen shorelines, changes in wave intervals caused by underwater topography, temperature shift sensed by touch, bioluminescent trails visible during moonless nights, which hinted at coral fields or schools of fish. At night, the sea surface was observed like a parchment, with wave shadows cast by stars, allowing skilled wayfinders to see changes in depth or direction. Some could even detect the distant vibration of waterfalls or heavy surf, borne across many kilometers by consistent wind. This relationship with water bordered on the sacred. To read the sea was to listen to the earth breathe. Storytelling as a navigational tool. In communities across Mindanao and the Visayas, navigation stories were embedded into folktales, epics, and legends. One such example comes from the Sugbonans, whose old epics told of Lapu-Lapu's fleet sailing under a moon shaped like a sliced mango. The mango moon was not just poetic, it was a calendar cue, referencing a particular lunar phase optimal for cross-island travel. Another tale speaks of a golden turtle that led a hero across the Sulu Sea, its back glowing in the night. This turtle was likely Venus, a celestial body whose bright, low movement helped guide Western routes. By embedding wayfinding knowledge into oral literature, communities ensured that even children, before learning to sail, were already being taught how to survive the sea. In this sense, mythology was a mnemonic atlas. Shipboard society. A long voyage was not just about direction, it required discipline and social structure. The typical crew aboard a Balangay included the Palu navigator, supreme authority on direction, weather, and rituals. The Timue, leader or elder, oversaw political or trade affairs. The Panday, boatright, responsible for the integrity of the hull and sails. Rowers and sail handlers, often members of a clan or extended family. Young apprentices, sent by families to learn the sea routes. Hierarchy was respected but fluid. Expertise, especially in navigation, could override age or wealth. Food was dried rice, smoked fish, sago, and fermented coconut. Water was stored in tightly woven rattan containers. Freshwater collection methods included catching rain in banana leaves or using layered sail cloth. Illness was treated with herbs or chants. Disputes were handled through ritualized debate because at sea, survival demanded unity. Everyone aboard knew that the boat was more than transport, it was community, survival, and fate. The return journey. Sailing wasn't just outbound. The return required equal precision, often during different seasonal winds. Navigators memorized reverse cues, or mirror signs. If a voyage to an island required 3 nights following a constellation's rise, the return might require tracking its descent, or switching to a different celestial marker entirely. Some routes could only be taken during certain times of year. Miss the window and you could be stranded or worse, lost at sea. And so communities had maritime calendars, organized not by the Gregorian months but by tide cycles, star paths, and wind signs. These calendars dictated when to build boats, when to sail, when to plant, and when to prepare offerings to sea spirits. One such offering, common among seafarers in Sulu, involved placing a carved shell or bone figure on the bow before a long voyage. The figure, known as a pangok, was said to hold ancestral memory, helping guide the boat home. Lessons in loss. By the early 20th century, this intricate system was all but gone. American and Spanish colonial forces discouraged traditional navigation, labeling it backward or superstitious. The introduction of modern shipping lanes, missionary schools, and written maps reshaped how people thought about movement. Children were taught geography without stories, stars without songs. Some elders kept the knowledge alive in fragments, but without voyages to practice them, the maps faded. The sea was no longer a friend to whisper to, but a space monitored by shipping permits, customs laws, and Coast Guard patrols. Today, many island children look at the ocean and see a barrier, not a path. But echoes remain. Some fishermen still read swells like their grandfathers. Some island names still hint at roots long unused. A few artisans in Tawi-Tawi still carve boat bows in the shape of spirits, even if they can't explain why. There is one question that lingers, quiet and unresolved. Can a map be restored if it was never written down, only felt, sung, and remembered in the rhythm of waves? The sea remembers, even when people forget. As we drift into the closing chapter of this story, we turn from the methods and maps of pre-colonial navigation to its greater meaning, the cultural, political, and spiritual role the sea played in shaping a maritime society that once flourished between the Philippines and its neighbors. We examine what was lost, but also what remains in whispers, fragments, and rediscovery. Because even now, in an age of satellites and steel hulls, the ancient knowledge of sailing by stars and swells may yet find its way back. Maritime diplomacy, trade beyond the reef. In pre-colonial times, crossing the sea was not just about survival or conquest, it was about connection. Sulu, Zamboanga, and Palawan were not peripheries, they were hubs. Merchants and emissaries launched voyages to and from places like Brunei, Champa, Borneo, Malacca, and even China. These were not isolated trips, but routine engagements in an ongoing maritime economy. Trade was central. Pearls, mother-of-pearl, beeswax, birds' nests, and trepang sea cucumber were exchanged for silk, porcelain, weapons, and spices. Chinese records from the Song and Ming dynasties describe gifts from Philippine rulers: gold, aromatics, rare woods received by Chinese emperors as tribute. Some Philippine polities, especially in the Sultanate of Sulu, even maintained diplomatic marriages and formal embassies with Borneo and Malay courts. None of this would have been possible without reliable sea travel, deeply rooted in pre-instrumental navigation. The sea was not unknown, it was governed, regulated by custom, and respected through ritual. Each channel and current had a name. There were neutral harbors and known pirate coves. A sailor could learn the maritime world without ever needing paper. But this system relied on continuity, on the steady passing of knowledge between generations. As colonization fractured polities and censored local leadership, this continuity was broken. Navigators as cultural memory keepers. The Palu, the master navigator, was more than just a guide. In some cultures, especially among the Bajau and Samadilao, the navigator also served as historian, reciting genealogies linked to travel and sea settlements. Priest, performing rituals before dangerous crossings. Counselor, settling disputes during long voyages. Astronomer, interpreting signs in the stars and weather. His or her knowledge was a blend of science, lore, and lived experience. To lose a Palu was not just the death of a person, it was the disappearance of an entire world view. One community in Tawi-Tawi remembers a navigator who died without naming a successor. His boat, untouched since, still sits under a tarp, slowly rotting, as if waiting for a new voice to awaken its keel. Some of his grandchildren speak of dreams where the old man calls them to sail, but they don't know how. There's no map, no song, no one left to teach. It's a story repeated across the archipelago. Colonization and the redrawing of space. When the Spanish and later American colonizers arrived, they did not merely conquer land, they redrew mental maps. Colonial authorities built forts facing the sea, indicating their perception of it as a threat. Trade was rerouted through controlled ports, and native vessels were either destroyed or repurposed. Churches were built inland, missions established away from traditional coastal centers. Even languages shifted, with words for boats, stars, and winds falling into disuse. The colonial curriculum taught flat, land-centered geography. Children learned about continents, latitude and longitude, not star positions, coral patterns, or ancestral roots. In essence, Filipinos were retrained to see the sea as distance, not connection. By the 20th century, sailing by memory was a rarity. Most boats used motors. Most routes followed ferry lanes. The silence of forgotten songs settled over the sea. The sea in modern memory. And yet the pull of that past remains. In places like Butuan, where ancient Balangay boats were unearthed in the 1970s, artisans have begun to rebuild replicas using traditional methods. Some efforts, like the Balangay Voyage Project, 2009-2011, sailed these reconstructed vessels from Mindanao to Luzon and beyond without modern instruments. The navigators, inspired by ancient ways, relied on celestial observation, wave patterns, and community stories. Their goal was not only historical, it was spiritual. They wanted to feel the world as their ancestors did, guided by memory, not machines. Even in modern education, some programs are reviving indigenous maritime heritage, collecting oral histories from elderly fishermen, teaching young students to read the sky, and restoring boat-building techniques. It is a slow effort, but perhaps slow is the right speed, like a balangay drifting across dawn light. A return to the water. Today, as climate change reshapes coastlines and globalization brings both threat and opportunity, there is growing recognition that ancient sea knowledge has value. It is sustainable. Balangays left no carbon footprint. It is resilient. Pre-colonial sailors could read weather changes better than satellite forecasts in some cases. It is cultural. It binds communities together across generations and distances. To teach a child to sail by the stars is to reclaim a story that was never truly lost, just submerged. Every chant remembered, every boat rebuilt, every journey made without GPS is a quiet revolution. Because in the vast sea of forgotten history, pre-colonial navigation is not just a technique, it is a way of being. And so we arrive at our final thought. If we could once again learn to see the sea not as what separates us, but as what connects us, what else might we rediscover? Story 3. The Balangay Builders of Butuan. In the thick, muddy soil of northern Mindanao, under layers of silt and silence, a buried fleet once slept. When construction workers near Libertad, Butuan City, began dredging for irrigation in 1976, they did not expect to uncover something older than Christianity in the Philippines. From the ground emerged planks of curved hardwood, darkened by time but unmistakably shaped by human hands. Soon after, archaeologists confirmed the truth. They had found a balangay, and not just one, but a fleet of them, more than 1,000 years old. These weren't ceremonial remnants or accidental wrecks. These were deliberately crafted, fully functional seafaring vessels, once part of a maritime culture that predated colonial history by centuries. And they told a very different story about ancient Filipinos. What was found beneath the earth? The first balangay uncovered measured 15 meters long, built from dungan wood, a dense, water-resistant hardwood native to Southeast Asia. Archaeologists soon discovered 8 more vessels, some buried deeper, others in fragments. Carbon dating revealed ages between 320 CE and 1250 CE, suggesting that boat building in Butuan spanned multiple generations. The site, located along the Agusan River Delta, would have connected Butuan to the Bohol Sea and onward to the wider world. These weren't lake boats, they were ocean-going ships, able to sail to Borneo, the Malay Peninsula, and possibly beyond. But what amazed researchers most was how these boats were made, without a single nail. Instead, the planks were joined by wooden pegs and fiber lashings, using a technique known as lashed lug construction. This ancient Austronesian technology is shared across Pacific Island cultures and parts of Southeast Asia. In a world often defined by written empires, stone temples, and golden crowns, the balangay offered something different, a reminder that movement, not monument, defined a people. The shipwrights of memory. The construction of a balangay required no blueprints. There were no scrolls of measurements, no sketches or models. The design lived in the minds and hands of the builders, often passed from father to son, master to apprentice. The boat started with a keel, carved from a single tree trunk. From there, curved planks were fitted along the sides, lashed tightly using holes and wooden dowels. The result was a flexible, resilient hull able to absorb the movement of rough seas without breaking. The fiber used for lashing was often nido vine or rattan, soaked for pliability and smoked for durability. Once the hull was shaped, a raised platform was built for cargo or warriors. Outriggers could be added, depending on the voyage's needs. Some larger balangays were double-decked, with spaces for steering and cooking. No two balangays were identical. Each bore the mark of its builder's memory, environment, and purpose. And each was considered a living thing blessed at launch, offered gifts, and named. A maritime civilization. What does the presence of these ships say about ancient Butuan? It means that far from being a backwater settlement, Butuan was likely a maritime center, a hub of trade, craft, and diplomacy. Chinese Song dynasty records from the 10th century describe Butuan's ruler sending emissaries to the Chinese court, bearing gifts of tortoiseshell and aromatics. Butuan appears in these records as bold and independent, with ships capable of long-distance navigation and rulers sophisticated enough to engage in international diplomacy. The city likely sat at the intersection of river and sea, with a society shaped by both. The Agusan River allowed inland resource extraction: gold, wood, rice, while the sea enabled connection to other polities. Trade likely flowed in all directions. To the south toward Borneo and Java. To the north along the eastern coasts of Luzon. To the west across the Sulu Sea and Palawan. To the east toward Micronesia or the Marianas, perhaps. Butuan's boats were not built for isolation. They were built to move, trade, and endure. Boats as status and state. In ancient Butuan, whoever controlled the balangays controlled power. The ability to construct and launch large vessels required access to dense forests for hardwood, skilled labor and apprenticeship networks, ritual specialists for launch ceremonies, storage and sheltered harbors, and most importantly, resources to sustain long voyages. This suggests an organized society, with economic stratification and a ruling class who could command labor and maritime resources. Boats were also used in warfare and tribute gathering, as seen across Southeast Asian cultures. Balangay raids may have collected slaves, shell valuables, or political hostages. But unlike land-based kingdoms with palaces and walls, Butuan left behind boats and river artifacts. What it lacked in architecture, it made up for in mobility and maritime power. Why they were buried? One mystery remains. Why were the balangays buried at all? There are several theories. Deliberate burial as ritual. Some experts believe the boats were ceremonially buried, perhaps after the death of an owner, as part of funerary rites. This practice is common among Austronesian societies. River shifting. The Agusan River has changed course over time. Some of the vessels may have sunk or been abandoned and later covered by sediment as the river shifted. Abandonment during crisis. It is possible that the boats were left behind during conflict, disease, or colonization, and subsequently buried by natural forces. Whatever the reason, their preservation was accidental and miraculous. The low oxygen, clay-rich soil prevented decay, offering a rare archaeological glimpse into a vanished world. And yet, very little has been written about the boat builders themselves. Their names are lost, their lineages unknown. Their descendants, if any, carry no memories of hulls shaped by lashed lugs and fire-hardened pegs. So we are left with an unanswered question. If the builders of the Balangay shaped a world of movement and meaning, why did history bury their stories along with their boats? The discovery of the Balangays beneath the soil of Butuan was a moment of revelation, but it was also a recovery of a silence. These boats were not just technological artifacts. They were embodiments of a lost voice, one that once spoke in creaking wood, chants of labor, and the subtle curve of hand-shaped hulls. But what became of the shipwrights, the Panday Sa Balangay, whose very livelihood crafted the vessels that stitched an archipelago together? Their legacy now lies in fragments, tools without names, grooves worn into stone, forgotten songs, and the ritual spaces near vanished rivers. In this section, we sail deeper into their world. The mind of a Panday. The Panday was more than a carpenter. In pre-colonial society, this person was a specialist, a cultural memory keeper, and a spiritual actor. While many might know how to repair a canoe or lash a small fishing boat, building a full balangay required an entire network of knowledge and people. The process could take months, even years, and always began with selecting the right tree. A Panday would trek into the forest with an apprentice, searching not for size alone, but shape, sound, and soul. The tree must curve naturally with the keel in mind. It must ring when tapped, like hollowed bronze. It must stand away from the others lonely, but not diseased. Once selected, a ritual offering would be left: beetle nut, a chicken egg, or even blood. This was to ask permission from the spirit of the tree. If the offering was rejected through broken yolk, sour taste, or an ill-omened bird call, the tree would be left alone. This was not superstition, it was cosmic negotiation. The sea was unpredictable, and every plank that met it had to be blessed and aligned. Carving with fire and fiber. The shaping of the balangay's hull was done with the simplest of tools. Adzes wielded with curved wooden handles. Stone or iron chisels, depending on the period. Fire hollowing, used to shape deep inner curves. There was no sawdust left behind. All waste was reused for fuel, resin, or fiber. The wood was burned in small, controlled bursts to soften it, then chiseled while still warm. This allowed for tight curves without splitting. Each plank was hand-matched. The Panday would hold it up to the hull, adjust the angle by eye, then make invisible calculations guided by feel, not formula. Holes were bored using manual drills, then lashed using softened rattan or bark strips, which shrank as they dried, pulling the structure tighter. It was a marvel of engineering, a boat strong enough to cross oceans, built with no nails, no screws, and no written plans. The final hull was caulked with resin mixed with crushed leaves or charcoal, then smoked to preserve it from insects and rot. Rituals of the hull. A balangay was not launched, it was born. Its final form was not complete until it had undergone ritual preparation, guided by a local Babylon spiritual medium or elder priest. This included naming the vessel, often after a spirit animal, ancestor, or protective deity. Anointing the keel with coconut oil, turmeric, and ash. Offering food and song to the sea spirits. Sometimes, a small idol or carved figure was fixed to the prow, a guardian known as a mananaw or pagdingol, often carved with wide eyes to watch the waves. These ceremonies weren't decorative, they were part of a cosmological system. In the watery world of ancient Butuan, nothing floated without consent from the invisible world. Even the order of stepping aboard mattered. The eldest walked first, facing the bow, while children walked backwards to avoid stealing the boat's sight. The life of a balangay. Once launched, a balangay might sail for decades carrying warriors, traders, and chieftains across vast distances. Historical records and archaeological findings suggest that Butuan's vessels traveled as far as Vietnam and southern China, evidenced by ceramics found at the site. Carried gold, likely from Mindoro or local Agusan mines, shaped into death masks, belts, and beads. Were used in tribute missions, such as those recorded in Chinese imperial archives in 1003 and 1011 CE. Some balangays were even used in burial rites, buried whole or in parts to accompany high-status individuals in death, offering safe passage in the afterlife. Every groove of a balangay bore human intent. You could touch the planks and still feel the chiseling rhythm of its maker, like fingerprints pressed into wood. But as time wore on, the tools fell silent. Why the builders were forgotten. The decline of the balangay tradition wasn't sudden, it was slow, marked by layers of erasure. Spanish colonizers introduced new ship designs and outlawed traditional raiding and boat building. Jesuit and Augustinian friars targeted Babylon rituals, labeling them demonic. The focus of society shifted from rivers and bays to churches and forts. The written word replaced oral blueprints, but the knowledge wasn't transcribed, it was lost. The final blow may have come from industrialization and American education, which prioritized land-based history, agriculture, and Western science. Children were taught that real ships had sails and nails, and that wooden lashings were primitive. No one bothered to ask the old men in the village how they used to read the wood, or where to place the fire. One wonders, were they waiting for someone to ask? The ghosts beneath Libertad. Today, the Libertad site where the Balangays were found has been developed, partially excavated, partially preserved. Some of the vessels are displayed at the National Museum in Butuan, housed in open pavilions. But others remain buried, protected by soil and time, awaiting further study. Local initiatives have tried to revive boat building, with mixed success. Recreated balangays have been launched in cultural events, and boat festivals held to teach the next generation. But still, very few know the names of the old shipwright families. No definitive genealogy survives. Their hands shaped a world, and now we barely recall the shape of their names. So we're left to wonder, what might we relearn about ourselves if we could once again build a vessel without nails, only trust, memory, and time? The Agusan River flows quietly now. It curves through Butuan like a soft thread through ancient cloth, carrying silt, stories, and silence. But centuries ago, it was a bustling artery, the very lifeblood of a maritime civilization. At its delta, balangays once launched into open water, their hulls gliding over tides, connecting islands and linking distant shores. In this final section, we reflect on the decline, the echo, and the revival of a culture that lived not behind walls, but in motion on water through memory. The disruption of motion. The downfall of the Balangay tradition was not caused by invasion alone. Rather, it was a confluence of many disruptions. Colonial maritime laws. Under Spanish rule, Filipino boats capable of long-distance travel were regulated or destroyed to prevent uprising or unsanctioned trade. The Balangay symbol of movement and self-sufficiency was seen as a threat to colonial control. Changes in trade routes, with Manila becoming the hub of Spanish shipping and the galleon trade tying the colony to Mexico, inland ports like Butuan lost strategic value. Trade turned to land-based systems and centralized control. Cultural reprogramming. Colonial missionaries often portrayed traditional boat building and spiritual rites as superstitious or demonic. Apprenticeship lines were broken. Ceremonial knowledge became shameful. Even the river lost status, its sacred role reduced to irrigation. Over time, the shipwright's tools were buried, forgotten, or repurposed. The craft became obsolete. Where once children learned to carve ribs for a hull, they now learned to read catechism. And so, a civilization built on movement became rooted in stillness. Rediscovery through soul. When archaeologists began uncovering the balangays in the late 1970s, there was little public understanding of their importance. The National Museum of the Philippines began documenting and preserving the finds, but for decades, the boats received only minimal national attention. Political upheaval, lack of funding, and limited academic infrastructure slowed efforts. It wasn't until the early 2000s that interest returned. Young historians began revisiting pre-colonial maritime narratives, aided by international comparisons with other Austronesian cultures. The link between Filipino identity and sea-based mobility slowly re-emerged. A turning point came in 2009, with the launch of the Balangay Voyage project. Sailing again, the modern Balangay Voyages. Led by adventurer and former naval officer Arturo Art Valdez, The Balangay Voyage project sought to rebuild and sail traditional balangays using ancient methods, without modern navigation tools. 3 replicas Diwata Ng Lahai, Masawahang Butuan and Sama Tawi Tawi were constructed by master boat builders from the Sama and Bajo communities, using wood, rattan, and hand tools. The ships were launched with ritual ceremonies, modeled after ancestral practices. Between 2009 and 2011, the crews sailed across the Philippine archipelago and into Southeast Asia, reaching Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia. They navigated using star paths, wave direction, cloud patterns, and sea color. They slept on deck, cooked over wood fire, and sailed like their ancestors. Along the way, they stopped at coastal communities and schools, sharing the story of the Balangay, its forgotten role in shaping Filipino history and identity. The voyage was not merely symbolic. It proved that ancient techniques could still work, that the skills once buried in Butuan soil could float again. The Balangay as mirror. What does the Balangay symbolize today? Interconnection. It reminds Filipinos that the archipelago was never isolated. Its people were voyagers, not victims of geography. Agency. The Balangay shows that Filipinos engaged in international diplomacy, complex trade, and sophisticated craft long before colonization. Memory. As an object built without plans, the Balangay embodies the idea that culture can survive without being written down as long as it is lived. In schools and museums, the Balangay is now featured in history curricula. Boat-building workshops have appeared in Visayas and Mindanao. Some local leaders have called for the UNESCO designation of the Balangay tradition as intangible cultural heritage. There is even a movement to make June 15, the day of the original boat's rediscovery, into Balangay Day. Still waters, still questions. Yet even with all this progress, many questions remain unanswered. What happened to the last true Panday of Butuan? How many Balangays are still buried beneath the river delta? Were the boats buried with full ceremonies or hastily, in fear? Could Balangay making become a living tradition again, not just for show, but for real use? These questions float like driftwood at the edge of memory, half submerged, waiting to be claimed. A boat without nails. To build a Balangay was to believe in trust. Trust that wood and fiber could hold against the open sea. Trust that memory was more enduring than parchment. Trust that each journey had meaning, even if the map was never drawn. We close this story where we began, at the mouth of the river where water meets sea, and the past still stirs beneath the silt. In Butuan, the river sings softly. It carries, as it always has, secrets in its current. And if you listen closely, can you hear the sound of carving plank meeting peg, lash meeting hull echoing from long ago, asking, what else might we still remember if we let the sea speak again? Story 4. Salt and smoke preserving fish in ancient Bicol. Before the era of refrigerators and freezers, before ice trucks rumbled through provincial highways and styrofoam coolers sat in every market stall, people had to find other ways to preserve what the sea gave them. In ancient Bicol, nestled between mountain slopes and volcanic shorelines, the smell of smoke curled through the morning air. Along the coastal inlets of Sorsogon, Albay, and the ragged fringes of Catanduanes, you would have found long wooden racks, hanging strips of fish, baskets of sea salt, and the crackling warmth of embers beneath. This was not cooking. This was preservation and art practiced for survival. Because fish, so abundant in the region, spoiled fast in the tropical heat, and every family, every community, knew that the real test of livelihood came after the catch. A coast that fed generations. The Bicol region has always been shaped by two opposing forces, the bounty of the sea and the volatility of the land. With Mount Mayon looming in the distance, volcanoes frequently altered the soil. Typhoons battered the coastline several times a year. And yet, the coastal environment remained rich in bangus, milkfish, galangong, round scad, chilingan, mackerel, tuna, and dillies anchovies. Fishing in ancient Bicol was typically small-scale and seasonal, dependent on tidal cycles and the phases of the moon. Sailors would head out in paro canoes, bringing back fish in woven baskets, wet with brine. But returning to land was only the beginning. The challenge was keeping the fish edible for more than a day, especially in the humid, sun-drenched climate, where rot set in within hours. That challenge gave rise to a quiet, meticulous system of fish preservation, passed down through the generations. Drying in the wind. The first and simplest method was air drying, used especially for small fish like dillies or balinao. Women and children cleaned the catch at sunrise, splitting fish with thin bamboo knives and removing the entrails. Then, on long raised bamboo racks, they arranged the fish in neat rows, heads pointed the same direction, tails aligned. The racks were placed in open, elevated areas, where sea winds were steady and the sun hit full by mid-morning. These locations were often communal, everyone shared the space, and the smell of drying fish became part of the coastal atmosphere. To keep flies away, dried guava leaves were sometimes burned beneath the racks. A thin haze of smoke hovered during peak hours, giving the fish a subtle aroma and helping prevent spoilage. This method turned the catch into light, leathery, salted fish that could last weeks if kept dry. But air drying had limits. The rainy season often rendered the process useless. And so the people turned to another ancient element, fire. The practice of smoking. For larger fish, or for use during monsoon months, smoking was the preferred method. Ancient smokehouses in Bicol were simple structures, low huts made of nipa and wood with controlled ventilation. Inside, fish were hung from split rattan poles, sometimes wrapped in leaves to maintain moisture. Below, smoldering fires made of coconut husks, driftwood, and banana leaves filled the space with a thick, pungent smoke. This process could last 8 hours to several days, depending on the size of the fish and the intended shelf life. The goal was not just dryness but infusion. Smoke acted as an antimicrobial agent, preserving the flesh while giving it that rich, savory aroma. The result was tinapa, a term still used today, derived from an older root meaning to be smoked or to be preserved. For Bicolanos, tinapa was not just food, it was strategy. It allowed fishing families to store food through storm seasons, to trade with inland communities, and to ensure provisions during volcanic evacuations, a sadly frequent occurrence in the shadow of Mayon and Bulusan. The role of salt. But both drying and smoking were only part of the equation. The third and essential element was salt. In ancient Bicol, salt was harvested from tidal flats through evaporation, especially in areas like Bacon Bay and Tiwi. Sea water was collected and left to dry in earthen pans, sometimes lined with banana leaves or powdered limestone to hasten the process. Salt was labor-intensive and seasonal. Because of this, it became a form of currency and tribute offered to village leaders, traded inland for rice, and used ceremonially in healing or protection rituals. To preserve fish, salt was rubbed into the flesh or used in brine baths. Some techniques called for alternating layers of fish and salt in clay jars, sealed with banana stalks or wax, and buried to ferment, a precursor to modern bagawong, fermented fish paste. This process, while less visible than smoking or drying, was perhaps the most important. Without salt, neither method worked. Salt was the quiet hero of preservation. And in a region where typhoons could isolate a community for weeks, salt meant the difference between scarcity and sustenance. Gendered knowledge. The work of fish preservation was highly gendered. Men handled the fishing and boat maintenance. Women mastered the drying, smoking, salting, and storage techniques. Mothers taught daughters not just recipes but seasonal timing, humidity thresholds, and spoilage cues. A fish too dry could crack and rot. Too little smoke left it vulnerable to mold. Salted fish stored too wet would ferment, not preserve. This was not written down but passed through gesture, rhythm, and repetition. Elders could tell the difference between fish dried in northern wind and southern wind. They could smell whether smoke came from coconut shell or mangrove root. Their bodies became the instruments of a generational laboratory, fine-tuned to the subtleties of food and environment. And yet, little of this knowledge made it into history books. Because it was done quietly, at the edge of fields, by hands calloused from work, by people who did not write. A day's labor and preservation. A typical day in a coastal Bicolano fishing village might look like this. 4:00 a.m., fishermen return with the catch. Women begin sorting by size and type. 5:30 a.m., children carry buckets of sea water to the drying racks. 7:00 a.m., fish are gutted, washed, salted. 9:00 a.m., drying begins, racks turned every hour. Noon onward, fires lit for smoking larger fish, smokehouses sealed. Evening, dried fish collected, packed in woven baskets, smoked fish cooled and inspected. Each movement served a purpose. Each action was measured not by clocks but by sunlight, smell, and wind. And over generations, this cycle became embedded into the rhythm of life itself. From survival to trade. By the late pre-colonial period, the products of Bicol's preservation methods dang, tinapa, fermented paste were already part of local trade routes. Salted and smoked fish were bartered inland for root crops, pottery, or firewood. Coastal communities became food hubs, sustaining mountain villages with preserved protein. This made Bicolanos not just fishermen but economic actors, trading resilience across landscapes. But as larger-scale trade networks grew and colonization rewrote food systems, much of this quiet industry was marginalized. It survived only in the home, on kitchen fires, and in the scent of smoke rising with the dawn. So we are left to wonder, if history is told by conquests and kings, who will tell the story of the women who saved fish from spoiling again and again, across centuries? As the fire smolders low and the smell of smoke clings to your clothes, you begin to understand something deeper, that preservation is not just a technique. It is a social contract, a seasonal rhythm, and a reflection of what communities value. In ancient Bicol, every salted fillet and smoked strip of tuna was the result of communal labor, tied to weather, trade, ritual, and risk. It was work done without ceremony but essential to life. Let us now look deeper into how this small but enduring economy of fish preservation shaped social structures, regional trade, and daily resilience, often without drawing the attention of historians, but always anchoring the lives of those who lived it. Salt, the currency of coastal power. In ancient Bicol, salt was not just a kitchen ingredient. It was a commodity of influence. Coastal families with access to tidal flats or salt pans, especially in Tiwi, Bacon, and parts of Camarines Sur, held significant social capital. The process of evaporation was laborious, seasonal, and dependent on dry weather patterns. This made salt production both risky and extremely valuable. During dry months, brine water was poured into shallow clay-lined pans, sometimes shaded with nipa to control drying speed. Workers used coconut shell scoops to remove impurities. The resulting crystals were stored in woven sacks or sealed clay jars and hidden during storms. Salt, when combined with fish preservation, extended the shelf life of fish by weeks or months. This allowed coastal communities to trade year-round, even during storm seasons. Salted fish, particularly dried chilingan, and daing na bangus, were carried inland on the backs of porters and exchanged for rice from upland farms in Iriga and Bao, rattan, honey, and root vegetables from tribal communities, firewood and charcoal, essential for smoking. Over time, salted goods created entire trade corridors, connecting the lowlands and highlands in networks of quiet, repetitive exchange. The men who caught the fish were remembered, but the women who dried and salted them built the foundation of the local economy. Communal smokehouses, shared space, silent rules. Smaller communities often operated shared smokehouses structures that required cooperation, but also careful regulation. Each family was given a time slot, often passed down by family rank. Fires had to be lit using only approved materials, since certain woods spoiled the fish or created harmful smoke. Young boys were sometimes tasked with keeping the fire consistent, while older women monitored texture, color, and moisture content. Even without formal governance, these smokehouses operated on a strict social order. Elders got the prime drying times. In-laws were expected to share racks or offer help with smoking. Disputes over fish placement or smoke time were mediated by local healers or midwives, trusted for their neutrality. And woven through this system were unspoken beliefs. A smokehouse where arguments happened was thought to spoil the batch. Fish preserved during a solar eclipse had to be thrown out or offered to spirits. The first tanapa of the season was given to the oldest woman in the village, who would bless it with salt and water before sharing it with children. These rules weren't written, but they were enforced by memory, reputation, and ritual. Risks in preservation. Preserving fish was not without danger. Smoke inhalation from enclosed huts caused chronic coughing or lung infections, especially in older women and children. Improper salting led to botulism and intestinal illness, though villagers often used guava leaf tea or charcoal ash as traditional remedies. Fires sometimes spread beyond smokehouses, especially during El Niño years, when bamboo became tinder-dry. To counteract these risks, some communities implemented protective customs. Hanging woven amulets, anting from the smokehouse door. Marking fish jars with ashes from sacred fires. Leaving a piece of fish on a banana leaf by the sea, an offering to appease anido or sea spirits, asking for safe preservation and calm seas. Such beliefs weren't fringe superstition. They were part of a practical worldview in which survival was negotiated not only through labor, but also through respect for balance and unseen forces. Inland markets and reputation. Preserved fish traveled far from Bicol's coast. Weekly inland markets Tabuan in towns like Balangay, Nabua, and Ligao featured baskets of dried or smoked fish brought in by foot, cart, or small rafts. Families that produced consistently high-quality tinapa developed reputations that extended across regions. Market buyers, especially rice farmers and herbalists, would form informal partnerships with fish families, promising bundles of pale, unmilled rice, in exchange for first access to smoked mackerel, herbal medicines and roots for curing spoiled fish, labor support during planting or harvest, as barter for salted products. Thus, the humble fish became a currency of community, weaving people together across distance, trade, and time. Preservation wasn't just about making food last. It was about making relationships endure. Colonial disruption and continuity. Spanish colonizers did not immediately disrupt the preservation economy. In fact, they benefited from it. Soldiers and missionaries relied on local preserved fish during travel and rainy season shortages. Tribute systems began to include smoked or salted fish, often counted by weight or jar. Fish preservation methods were recorded in friar field journals, though often misunderstood or dismissed as primitive. In later centuries, colonial policy began to centralize salt production, taxing it or declaring it a monopoly. This made community-level salting more difficult. Still, many families continued to salt and smoke in secret, especially during famine or blockade. Preserved fish kept people alive when food shipments failed, when Mayon erupted, when roads washed out, when galleon ships arrived late. This made the practice quietly defiant, a kind of survival protest. A knowledge passed in smoke and salt, beneath the empire's notice. Echoes of a smoky legacy. Even today, the practices of ancient fish preservation linger. In Bicolano households, tinapa is still served with suket bawang, vinegar, and garlic. Daingna dilis remains a market staple. Smokehouses exist, though few realize how far back they go. Some coastal elders still choose to smoke their own fish, refusing plastic-wrapped imports. They speak of the old way, measuring weather by sea smell, deciding smoke time by sun angle. Occasionally in the early morning, you can still smell it, a hint of fire, brine, and time. A reminder that food is not just flavor. It is memory preserved. So we must ask, if preservation shaped how we endured the storms of the past, what traditions might we still need to carry us through the storms ahead? As smoke curls into the morning sky and sun glints off a woven drying rack, the quiet labor of preservation continues uninterrupted across centuries. In this final section, we turn our attention to the cultural, environmental, and historical legacy of ancient Bicol's fish preservation practices. We examine not only how these methods sustained lives, but also how they shaped identity, resisted colonization, and echoed into the present day. Because even now, in the age of refrigeration and instant meals, the knowledge embedded in salt and smoke remains not just in food, but in the way people endure. Identity woven in fiber and fire. For many families, especially along Bicol's coasts and river inlets, fish preservation was more than subsistence, it was inheritance. A girl might grow up learning how to salt a chilingan just enough to keep it soft, not brittle, which smoke from driftwood would bring out sweetness, and which would turn the fish bitter. When to gather banana leaves to line storage jars not too green, not too dry. These skills weren't written but felt taught through repetition and intuition. Even gestures had meaning, the way a hand cupped salt, the timing of a rack's turn under the sun. This kind of embodied knowledge was often invisible to the colonizers, overlooked by historians, and erased by the slow tide of industrialization. And yet it was knowledge that kept communities alive during storms, famines, uprisings, and isolation. It was a quiet but enduring cultural technology. Environmental adaptation. Preservation practices were also deeply adapted to the local environment. The Pacific typhoon belt meant families needed months of shelf-stable food. Volcanic eruptions, such as from Mount Mayon, frequently displaced entire villages, forcing reliance on preserved provisions for survival in temporary shelters. Shifting coastlines and saline intrusion required constant flexibility in drying locations, salt harvesting, and smokehouse building. What seemed simple smoking fish was actually a highly responsive, location-specific craft. It was sustainable too. Fires used waste materials, coconut husks, bamboo offcuts. Salt came from solar evaporation, not mining. Leftover bones, heads, and tails were turned into soup stock or dried as pet feed. Spoiled batches were composted into garden soil or used to bait crab traps. Nothing was wasted. Every part had a use. The system fed itself, balancing with the land and sea it depended on. Fish as resistance. It may sound strange, but fish preservation, particularly tinapa, and dyeing, played a subtle role in resisting colonial dependency. When rice shipments from Luzon failed, when Spanish galleons didn't return, or when missionaries attempted to disrupt food rituals, preserved fish remained. It was untaxable when hidden, It was shareable in community networks. It traveled easily during evacuation or flight. In fact, during the Philippine Revolution in the late 19th century, accounts from Sorsogon suggest that guerrilla fighters relied on local tinapa and saltfish to sustain operations in the mountains. These products, smoked by women in secret, moved silently across rebel lines. In this way, preserved fish was a weapon of resilience, an edible form of autonomy, made without permission. It required no imports, no oversight, just wood, salt, and knowing hands. Rituals of memory. Many old families, especially in villages near Donsal, Gubat, and Tiwi, still perform ancestral offerings that feature preserved fish. During Pagsanghiyang ancestral summoning, or Ateng offering rites, families lay out banana leaves with cooked rice, salted or smoked fish, coconut or sugarcane wine, bits of betel nut or banana. The preserved fish represents continuity, the ability to keep food alive, even when harvests fail or the sea turns rough. It is an acknowledgement of what was once fragile and fleeting, now held steady by memory. Some say the scent of tinapa calls spirits home more quickly than incense. Perhaps because they remember it, because it was the smell of their lives. Modern shifts and preservation of practice. Today, the preservation methods of ancient Bicol still exist, but they compete with industrial versions. Mass-produced dang often uses chemical preservatives. Commercial tinapa is processed in large smoke ovens and packed in plastic. Traditional salt production has declined due to urbanization and sea pollution. Still, a revival is stirring in quiet corners. Women's cooperatives in Albay and Sorsogon are returning to traditional salting and drying methods, marketing artisanal dang and tinapa. Local chefs are reinterpreting ancient recipes, pairing them with heritage rice or vinegar brewed in earthen jars. Small museums and barangay cultural centers are recording elder testimonies, preserving chants, techniques, and folk names for fish and salt. Some communities are even teaching children how to build drying racks and smokehouses, not as chores, but as acts of remembrance. It's a subtle kind of revival, not flashy, not funded, but real. Like smoke rising steadily, silently, from a nipa hut at dawn. Final reflections. Preservation, in its most basic form, is an act of faith that what we prepare today will feed us tomorrow. In ancient Bicol, that faith was embedded in every salted scale and every smoked fillet. It was faith in community, in memory, in weathering uncertainty. Fish was more than food, it was a promise, made in the presence of the sea. And now, as storms grow stronger, as traditions fade and come again, we might ask, what else besides fish can we learn to preserve through care, through fire, through time? Story 5. The day the rice ran dry, irrigation struggles in Ilocos. In the heat of late summer, the rice paddies of Ilocos Norte should shimmer like green glass, each stalk upright, thick with grain, bowing gently in the wind. You should hear frogs croaking in flooded fields, carabaos snorting as they turn the mud, and the rhythmic splash of barefoot farmers planting by hand. But not that year. That year the fields cracked. That year the paddies turned to dust. That year the rains never came. This is the story of ancient irrigation systems in the Ilocos region, how communities survived despite climate unpredictability, and how control over water shaped more than just farming but social status, conflict, and collective memory. It is a story not often told in the grand arcs of Philippine history, but for those who lived it, it was everything. Rice and water, an ancient marriage. In pre-colonial Ilocos, centuries before aqueducts, diesel pumps, or national irrigation programs, farming communities depended entirely on seasonal water movement. Rain-fed paddies lined the valleys, carved terraces hugged the foothills of the Cordillera Ranges, and ancestral water routes traced paths from mountains to coast. The Ilocos region, especially Ilocos Norte, had limited flat land, rocky coastlines, and a dry season that could last up to 6 months. Unlike the wetter provinces of central Luzon or the Visayas, Ilocos farmers had to be masters of water control. They developed early communal irrigation systems, composed of tad-tad or baus, temporary wooden sluices and stone-lined canals that diverted spring or river water into rice fields. Intakes made of woven reeds, controlled by placing stones or sandbags to adjust flow. Small earth dams, renewed each year with labor from surrounding families. These were not massive engineering projects but sensitive, adaptive systems, rebuilt and refined over generations. The entire rice cycle from planting to harvest depended on the first dependable rains of May or June. If the monsoon stalled or shifted, entire villages could face hunger. Shared water, uneven access. Although the water flowed through public channels, access was rarely equal. In many communities, water distribution was controlled by elders or local leaders, who kept mental ledgers of when each family could open their field gates. The upstream families naturally had more control, and in times of scarcity, this imbalance became stark. To keep peace, villages established taripnang regular meetings where farmers negotiated water use, repair duties, and planting schedules. These meetings were conducted under large trees or in bamboo halls, led by the barangay captain or elder farmers, who kept oral histories of floods, droughts, and past agreements. But not all disputes ended peacefully. When one family diverted water prematurely or kept the sluice open too long, others further downriver suffered. Dried paddies meant lost harvests, and accusations turned to feuds. There are still stories of men sneaking out at night to sabotage a neighbor's canal, cutting bamboo gates or redirecting flow. Even today, some family names in Ilocos are whispered with agricultural grudges centuries old. The year the fields dried. There are oral histories passed down in Vigan, Pitig, and Batak of a particularly severe drought, believed to have occurred in the late 1500s, possibly aligned with El Niño, like climate shifts. In this year, rivers shrank to trickles. Mountain springs ran dry. Entire stretches of paddy land were left unplanted. Farmers tried desperate measures, digging temporary wells in stream beds, hauling water from distant sources using carabaos and woven buckets, funneling bamboo pipes from remaining springs into shared pools. Still, the harvest failed. Old men remembered burying sacks of spoiled pale to prevent rotting infestations. Mothers boiled rice mixed with sweet potato skins, stretching meals for entire families. Some families left their fields and became salt makers or weavers, turning to crafts instead of crops. Others sold land to those who had private water rights, a shift that permanently changed land ownership patterns in the region. And some unable to feed their children migrated south, walking for days to find wage labor in Pangasinan or even Manila. In the memory of Ilocano elders, that year was never given a name. It was simply called T-Panon, a Nadakal T-Cap, the time when weariness was great. The dams that weren't built. In the decades that followed, there were attempts to improve irrigation, some led by Datis, others by early Spanish colonizers who recognized the agricultural value of Ilocos. But the proposed system, stone aqueducts, permanent channels, were often too expensive, labor-intensive, or resisted by locals who saw them as tools of control. In one record from 1623, a Spanish friar notes that villagers in Badak refused to maintain the new canal, citing ancestral rights and suspicion that the project would benefit only the encomenderos' lands. Instead, the community dug its own diversion canal in secret, using it only at night to water the lower paddies. These small rebellions, unrecorded by history, were acts of quiet defiance and local engineering genius. And they highlight an enduring truth: control of water was control of power. When water defined worth. In Iloco's society, especially in earlier centuries, a family's status was often tied not to how much land they owned, but how well they irrigated it. Fields with consistent water access fetched higher dowries. Marriages were sometimes arranged between landowning family and skilled water stewards. Rituals for rain involved old water masters sprinkling offerings from the river's edge, invoking ancestors to unclog the sky. In this way, the flow of water shaped social structure, spiritual practice, and economic opportunity. The dry year, like others that came before and after, revealed the fragility of this balance and the strength of the people who endured it. But the memory of drought never fully left. Even today, some Ilocano farmers say that the sound of a dry canal in May feels louder than thunder. And so we are left with this question. If water once decided who ate and who starved, who remembers the names of those who redirected the stream with nothing but shovels, sweat, and stubbornness? If you follow the dry bed of an old canal through Iloco's north, it may take you through a rice field now planted with tobacco. You might see cracked cement, a few carved stones overgrown with vines, and an old bamboo gate sagging against the flow that no longer comes. But once this trench was everything. It was a lifeline, a bargain with nature, and a source of both unity and division. In this section, we explore how irrigation in Ilocos evolved from ancestral know-how to contested colonial infrastructure, and how water itself became a tool not only for growing crops, but for defining who held power. A community of labor. In early Ilocano society, irrigation was never an individual act. The construction and upkeep of water systems, small canals, dikes, sluices relied on communal labor governed by the principle of bayanihan. It was not optional. It was a responsibility embedded in land use. Each landholder was expected to help repair dikes at the start of the planting season, dig and clear canals during the dry months, offer labor, not money, with tools in hand, not coins. Failure to participate could lead to reduced water access or community censure. In some villages, elders tracked participation orally, assigning privileges according to contribution. This wasn't generosity, it was mutual dependence. Without full participation, the canals failed and everyone suffered. And so, across generations, the act of digging irrigation channels became more than labor. It was a seasonal ritual, marking time and renewing bonds. But as colonial systems took root, that ritual began to shift. Colonial engineering and its discontents. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Spanish colonial authorities had taken interest in organizing and expanding irrigation not for local food security, but to increase rice production for tribute and trade. Missionaries and encomenderos began planning larger canals and stone aqueducts, often conscripting local laborers through polo y servicio, the forced labor tax. These efforts led to the building of gravity-fed canals sourced from upland rivers, diversion dams with stone and lime structures, new planting schedules favoring more frequent harvests. While some improvements did bring increased yield, many locals resisted these projects, seeing them as disruptive to existing agricultural calendars, biased toward elite-owned lands downstream, often constructed without input from the very farmers they were meant to serve. In several cases, farmers sabotaged colonial waterworks, flooding fields prematurely, dismantling sluices, or refusing to plant according to new timetables. These were acts of resistance cloaked in mud and silence. The water, which once flowed under mutual agreement, now flowed under decree. The rise of the AMAT. As irrigation systems grew more complex, a new role emerged: the AMAT, or water keeper. The AMAT was responsible for managing sluice gates, allocating flow time by field, settling disputes between farmers, supervising repairs, and organizing labor. Traditionally, the AMAT was chosen by the community, often an elder or experienced farmer. Their authority came from trust and knowledge. But in the colonial era, the role was increasingly appointed by town officials, often given to politically connected families. This change meant that water access could be manipulated for favors or punishment. Those close to the AMAT gained earlier planting rights. Entire harvests could fail if someone fell out of favor. In response, some communities reverted to hidden systems, secret side canals, alternate inlets, or palihi rituals to divert water spiritually when physically denied. The water still flowed, but not always through official channels. Women at the banks. While men often took part in digging and canal maintenance, women played key roles in water-related decision-making, especially within the household. Mothers determined when to cook the last rice, or whether to trade rice for corn. Grandmothers kept oral calendars, noting flood years and planting success. Wives negotiated with neighboring families during drought years, bartering labor or fish for irrigation favors. In times of extreme scarcity, it was often women who carried water in earthen jars to fields in the pre-dawn hours, tracked evaporation rates in backyard plots, monitored seedlings, shifting planting spots meter by meter to chase moisture. Their contributions weren't formalized, but they were essential. Some still say, T. Danum dinto axel salimtmid, it whispers first to the women. The drought of memory. Years of water scarcity, whether caused by climate or conflict, left deep psychological traces. Children learned to fear cloudless skies, associating them with hunger. Local songs, Dalat and Kankanta, included verses about bitter fields and faithful rain. Farmers spoke of dreams where rivers turned away, or the moon dried the soil. These cultural expressions reveal how irrigation was not just infrastructure, it was emotion, memory, and belief. And though written records of these years are rare, oral histories persist. In families across Ilocos, there are still stories of fields abandoned for a generation, then replanted when water returned. Love matches broken over canal disputes. Children named after rainfall, born on the first night of a long-awaited storm. In this way, irrigation became inheritance, passed down through story as much as through soil. So we must ask, when a river no longer flows and a canal dries out, is it only water that's lost or something far older, deeper, and harder to measure? Today, in the shadow of cemented roads and motorized pumps, the old irrigation canals of Ilocos seem like whispers. Some are overgrown with grass. Others are filled with stagnant rainwater. A few have been absorbed into modern systems lined with concrete, marked with numbers, administered by government agencies. But the old knowledge, dug by hand and carried in memory, has not entirely disappeared. In this final section, we follow how the ancient irrigation culture of Ilocos echoes into the present, how it remains not as artifact but as behavior, and how water still tells stories if you know where to listen. Irrigation in the 20th century, transformation and tension. By the 1900s, as American colonial policies encouraged the expansion of agricultural productivity, large-scale irrigation modernization swept across the Ilocos region. Engineers from the Bureau of Public Works began designing systems intended for broader efficiency. Steel gates replaced bamboo weirs. Cement-lined ditches took over from earthen trenches. Centralized control maps were drawn, assigning volume, rate, and flow time. To many, this brought relief. With more reliable water delivery came higher yields, reduced labor, and the promise of stability. But not everyone benefited equally. Smallholders in upland zones still relied on seasonal springs, not central channels. Maintenance budgets often neglected remote tributaries. And the complex social rules that once governed water sharing became rigid bureaucracies, inaccessible to non-literate farmers. In essence, water knowledge passed from hands to documents. What had once been fluid literally and socially was now measured, scheduled, taxed. And yet people adapted. In corners of the region, they still maintained unregistered canals, operated with ancestral schedules, functioning quietly beneath official infrastructure. The return of dry years. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, climate variability re-emerged as a critical threat. El Niño events in the 1990s and 2010s caused multiple planting failures. River sources dried earlier than predicted. Groundwater extraction led to subsidence and saltwater intrusion. Farmers who had grown used to consistent irrigation now had to relearn older techniques. Terracing hillsides to catch runoff. Planting sorghum systems alternating wet and dry rows. Returning to crop-sharing networks, where neighboring fields were irrigated alternately, just as in the old Tarapnang days. Ironically, ancestral methods, once dismissed as outdated, became lifelines again. And communities that retained oral knowledge of seasonal water behavior, river quirks, and soil temperament found themselves better able to adapt than those who had depended entirely on modern flowcharts. The past had something to teach, after all. Ritual and reclamation. In some Ilocano towns, efforts have begun to document, revive, and even celebrate traditional irrigation culture. Barangay festivals have reintroduced ceremonial pauliuli, symbolic reopening of canals during planting season. Elders are now invited to school events to explain how water was once shared by memory, not meter. Heritage maps mark old canal systems, even if dry, as part of cultural preservation. One notable initiative in San Nicolas, Ilocos Norte, led by a local university, involves interviewing elderly farmers about unwritten water-sharing rules, mapping forgotten springs and tributaries once critical to the community, training students to understand water behavior through observation rather than only instrumentation. In doing so, these efforts suggest that irrigation is not just about technology. It is about relationship between land, people, and the unseen rhythms of nature. The ghosts of canals. So many old canals remain, barely visible. A dip in the roadside that floods just so during heavy rain. A stone placed precisely at the bend of a hill, once part of a diversion weir. A clump of bamboo growing in a straight line through a tobacco field, tracing an ancient watercourse. And then, of course, the stories. The farmer who refused to sell his land unless the canal stone was preserved. The granddaughter who still plants first after the rain because her grandmother told her the soil there remembers the water. The boy who once diverted a stream with his hands, only to be called amat in jest by the elders. These are not just memories. They are techniques, histories, and testaments to how human survival in Ilocos was always shaped by the effort to move water. Not with machines, but with stone, bamboo, sweat, and story. Final reflections. To control water in a land of both drought and flood was always a gamble, a delicate balance, an exercise in patience and negotiation. But Ilocano farmers managed it not with vast dams or elaborate theories, but with community, experience, and a sense of shared fate. The canals may have run dry, but the knowledge flows still beneath the surface, along the furrows of memory, waiting for the next generation to dig again. So when the rain doesn't come, and the modern pumps go quiet, ask this: Who among us still remembers how to listen to the land and call the water back home? Story 6. Shell Currency, the Strange Economy of Panay's Cowries. Before paper bills crinkled in wallets or coins clinked in pockets, there was a time in the Visyas when wealth came from the sea, not in the form of fish, but in shells. Tiny, glossy, and pale as milk, cowrie shells once served as a legitimate form of currency in many parts of Southeast Asia. And on the island of Panay, these shells weren't just a form of payment. They were symbol, ritual, and power. In this story, we examine how a humble sea snail known to biologists as Cypria monita came to underpin a complex coastal economy and a rich cultural tradition. This isn't the story of great conquests or royal decrees. It's about everyday transactions, long-forgotten markets, and the quiet rhythm of barter and belief. And how, once upon a time, people carried their fortunes in woven bags of shells. A currency born from the shore. On the coasts of Panay, especially near Antique, Aklan, and Capiz, the beaches once teemed with shellfish. Among them, the cowrie stood out for its unusual features. A smooth, rounded shape, fitting easily between thumb and forefinger. A glossy surface, naturally polished by tide and time. A pale ivory color, sometimes with specks of cream or brown. Because of its beauty, the cowrie first entered Panay's economy not as currency, but as decoration and offering. Worn on belts or necklaces to signal status or fertility. Placed in rice granaries as charms to encourage abundance. Used in ancestral rites, where the sound of shells being poured out invoked memory and blessing. But over time, these shells, easily counted, hard to counterfeit, and naturally limited in supply, became something more. They became money. The market without coins. In pre-colonial Panay, there were no state-issued coins. Trade relied on a mix of barter and object currency items like beads, iron tools, and occasionally gold piloncitos in elite exchanges. For ordinary people, especially in inland barangays and fishing villages, the cowrie became the most trusted and widespread medium of exchange. People might use cowries to buy rice from neighboring farms, hire a weaver to finish a new skirt, pay a midwife or healer, settle minor debts between households. A set of common values emerged, passed down orally. 1 chicken equals 60 cowries. 1 roll of abaca equals 120 cowries. 1 basket of salt equals 40 cowries. A small plot of land equals several hundred cowries, plus ceremonial exchange items like a spear or a betel nut container. These transactions weren't rushed. They were communal, sometimes accompanied by betel chewing, small feasts, and hours of discussion. Cowries were counted slowly, often using strings or mats with shell markers. The sound of them clicking softly in woven bags became part of the landscape. Shells with social weight. Though tiny, the shells carried enormous social meaning. A child's birth might be celebrated with a handful of cowries sewn into their blanket. Marriages were marked with cowrie dowries, paid by grooms to a bride's family not as price, but as gesture of readiness. Cowries were sometimes buried with the dead, believed to help them buy their way to the afterlife or serve as tokens of passage. Certain shamans and priestesses, known locally as Babalan, kept shell caches in bamboo containers, using them for divination. They would cast shells onto a mat, interpret the way they landed, and speak of fortunes, warnings, or ancestral messages. The cowrie was not just money, it was a mirror of a person's life stage, connections, and fate. Shell sourcing and trade routes. While cowries were found naturally on Panay's shores, their abundance varied by season and location. As demand grew, shell collection became a specialized craft. Children were sent to search for them at dawn. Skilled collectors knew which tide pools yielded the best shells. Older women sorted shells by color and condition, removing damaged pieces and soaking them in salt water to preserve sheen. Shells also entered Panay through trade. Neighboring islands such as Guimaras and Negros offered surplus cowries in exchange for woven mats, pottery, or dried fish. Over time, an informal shell network formed, linking barangays and islands in loose trade alliances. These were not official empires. They were everyday economies, run on trust, memory, and the slow but steady rhythm of coastal life. The beginning of disruption. Of course, no local system lasts forever unchanged. As the Spanish colonial presence expanded through the Visayas in the 16th and 17th centuries, cowrie-based economies came under increasing pressure. Tribute systems demanded silver or rice, not shells. Cowries were dismissed as primitive, their use discouraged or taxed. Formal markets began operating in Spanish-controlled towns, where peso-based exchange slowly replaced traditional trade. But for many in rural and upland Panay, cowries remained the de facto medium well into the 18th century. They were easier to carry than rice, less risky than barter, more culturally embedded than any foreign coin. Still, the balance was shifting. And so we ask, what happens to a community when its money is declared worthless, while its memory of that money remains? By the time the Spanish fully entrenched themselves in the Visayan Islands, the cowrie economy had already begun to ebb, but it did not disappear overnight. Instead, it lingered, resisting, adapting, and subtly transforming the way people thought about value, trade, and survival. In this section, we explore the slow erosion of cowrie currency in Panay, how colonial systems tried to enforce a new monetary order, and how the people, especially those in inland and upland communities, responded with quiet persistence. Colonial currency meets coastal logic. The Spanish introduced a new system of currency across the Philippines: silver reals, gold onzas, and eventually the peso, minted in Mexico and later in Manila. These coins were heavy, stamped with symbols foreign to the local people, and distributed first to urban and ecclesiastical centers. For remote communities like those inland from Calibo or along the rugged coastlines of Antique, the colonial money was hard to access, inconvenient for daily trade, distrusted due to its unfamiliarity. For example, a fisherman in Barbaza might still prefer to receive 60 cowries for a basket of dried squid, rather than a Spanish reel he couldn't break at the local pamelihan. And so, even as colonial officials outlawed cowries in formal markets, they remained alive in Bacali exchanges, market corners away from the friar's view, ritual offerings where foreign coins were taboo. Spanish chroniclers expressed frustration at this. In a 1710 report from Iloilo, a governor wrote, "The people still favor shells over proper coinage, exchanging them as though we had never come." The conversion of the markets. To force monetary alignment, colonial administrators took several steps. Market regulation. Major tiang markets were moved closer to town centers, often near churches or casa reals, where friars and officials could monitor transactions. Tax collection in coin. Tributes could no longer be paid in kind or cowries, only in peso-based coinage. Legal penalties. Laws forbade shell-based payments in official contracts, trade permits, or land transactions. Currency conversion posts. Travelers from remote barangays were sometimes required to exchange their shells for silver at highly unfavorable rates. This slow suppression of cowries was part of a broader attempt to collapse traditional economies into colonial administration, but it didn't always work. Many villagers simply returned to barter or hid their cowrie transactions behind communal trust. Some devised clever hybrid systems. They used cowries as promissory tokens, redeemable for goods rather than direct exchange. Families loaned cowries among themselves, sidestepping colonial oversight entirely. In some areas, people agreed on standardized shell bundles to equal a coin, avoiding direct use but maintaining the value reference. The rise of local brokers. As colonial restrictions increased, a new figure emerged in many Visayan barangays, the cowrie broker. These individuals acted as intermediaries between shell-using communities and coin-based colonial markets, traded bundles of shells for low-value coins, taking a cut in the process, traveled by boat or foot, carrying woven shell pouches alongside silver coins. Though often seen as opportunists, they performed a vital function, bridging two economic worlds. In oral histories from Tapas and Lambanao, old folks still tell stories of the man with the heavy belt, or the woman who clinked when she walked, referring to cowrie brokers who could be heard before they were seen. Some gained notorious status, especially if they were accused of cheating villagers with unfair exchanges. Others became folk heroes, remembered for generosity during droughts or for helping a wedding go forward when no peso could be found. Cowries in ritual and debt. Even as their role in commerce faded, cowries grew in symbolic value. In spiritual contexts, cowries continued to be used by Babylon during ceremonies. They were dropped into earthen jars as offerings, a gesture of spiritual payment. In healing rites, a handful of cowries might be placed on the chest of the sick, symbolizing the exchange of pain for peace. In legal and social contexts, small debts among neighbors were still sometimes tracked using shell tokens, a string of 3 cowries meaning, for 1 ganter of rice, 5 meaning, labor owed for a day. More than currency, cowries had become a kind of mnemonic device, an object that reminded people of obligations, memories, and mutual trust. Unlike coin, which was impersonal and unyielding, the shell was intimate. It passed from hand to hand with warmth, context, and history. The final disappearance. By the mid-19th century, as the peso system became entrenched, cowries finally began to vanish from daily economic use. Imported goods required coin. Taxes were non-negotiable. Cowries became impractical in larger trades or travel. But they did not vanish from memory. Some were sewn into heirloom textiles, used as accents in patadyong skirts or ceremonial belts. Others were stored in clay jars, placed on home altars as symbols of good fortune. In Banga and Lizo, a few households even kept old shell bundles in sealed gourds brought out only during funerals or ancestral offerings. And so the shell that once bought chickens and paid dowries now sat quietly among saging na saba and candles, a reminder of another world. So we wonder, if a shell once meant everything: food, healing, promise, what replaces that memory when it becomes silent in the palm? If you visit the older homes of rural Panay today, you might notice something curious: a clay jar tucked into a corner, or a tiny shell embedded in the embroidery of a patadyong. These details seem insignificant until you ask. Then the story begins. The jar, they'll say, once held the family's bawon, their store of wealth, and the shell on the fabric. It was sewn in by a grandmother who once traded 5 of its kind for rice during a flood year. And though modern bills and coins now dominate every transaction, the memory of cowrie currency, the money that once washed up with the tide, still lingers in corners, in stories, and in songs. This final section explores how the legacy of cowrie money lived on, not in commerce, but in ritual, language, and cultural survival. Cowries in song and proverb. Even after they disappeared from markets, cowries stayed alive in Visayan oral traditions. Children's songs from the 19th century included lyrics like Cuarta sang dagat, kasingame sang tulan, pero inday maloko. Money of the sea, small as a bone but never a lie. Proverbs 2 spoke of the shell's quiet reliability. Janbado ko ang kabuhi sang sa kasige. I wagered life on a single shell. Maisaligan, paing sige kaysa sa bugas sang Castilla. One can trust the shell more than Spanish rice. These phrases weren't simply poetic, they were political. They hinted at a cultural resistance to colonial systems, a refusal to forget the value of what once held meaning. Even today, some elders will refer to small debts or symbolic payments as bayad sige, even if they're paying in pesos. The shell became metaphor, cultural shorthand, and relic of autonomy. Cowries in marriage and death. Despite losing their role in daily trade, cowries continued to hold deep significance in life events. In remote areas of Panay well into the early 20th century, bridewell ceremonies sometimes included cowries tied into the corners of a scarf or hidden in a gift basket, not for payment, but for luck. At funerals, a shell might be placed under the tongue of the deceased, a practice believed to help the spirit speak in the next world, or purchase safe passage across the river of souls. During house blessings, cowries were buried at each corner post, along with rice, salt, and a small coin, representing old and new prosperity. These practices weren't about utility anymore. They were about memory, the need to tie the present to a past in which the sea once paid the bills. The anthropologists arrive. By the 1930s and 40s, Western scholars began documenting cowrie traditions in the Visyas, often viewing them as quaint or obsolete. But for the communities they observed, these practices weren't backward, they were resilient. In the American period, as new currencies flooded the islands and economic systems were formalized through banks and cooperatives, the cowrie's legacy remained. Some community credit circles modeled their values on older shell barter systems. Women's groups used shells in teaching thrift and saving, small tokens representing contribution, trust, and responsibility. Teachers told students the stories of shell money to emphasize self-sufficiency and ancestral wisdom. The shells may no longer have bought fish or fabric, but they still taught economics of a kind based on mutual need, slow trade, and ecological rhythm. Cowrie collections and cultural amnesia. Today, cowries are found in souvenir shops, mounted in jewelry, or collected by tourists. Their economic past is largely forgotten outside academic or local history circles. Yet in barangay halls and ancestral homes, a few families have kept cowrie collections. Tied in strings of 10, 50, or 100, just as they were once stored. Cleaned and repolished each year for All Saints' Day or fiestas. Shown to grandchildren who ask, Lola, ano nga kabidlay pislatin? In this way, cowries now serve as teaching tools, reminders that money, value, and survival have always been invented and reinvented by the people, shaped not by banks, but by daily necessity and imagination.